Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Leadership Development Office radio show and podcast. We're calling Leadership in Practice. We're very excited to be talking about performance management today with specific reference to feedback and accountability. I'll be your host today, along with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Matthew Painter.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again as we dive into the performance management topic with Toni Leeth. Toni, in our first session, we talked a lot about, talent development and mentoring and that sort of thing. But now we kind of need to switch gears because that's only part of the performance management puzzle, if you will. So when you think about accountability, or when I think a lot of us, when we think about accountability, we get this negative connotation in our mind. Can you help us unpack why and whether or not we even should?
That's a great question. And it's so true. I think the first thing you think with accountability is when someone hasn't met it, and when we talked before, we talked about expectations. And I think so much of whether that's be, performance review, it be accountability and feedback, it starts first with, did I do my job as a leader for communicating expectations? And not just, well, that one meeting we had when you started, well, come on, there's an expectation on us as the leader that we are clearly communicating those expectations. I think part of our responsibility as a leader is communicating frequently and with clarity. I use that a lot, right? I don't have a crystal ball. I can't guess, what the expectations are for me, but I can't expect the same for other people. So I do think that that's where we go, is a little bit of a negative space with accountability, that we think it's a bad thing.
Yeah, we do tend to think about it from somebody didn't meet the expectation, right? But you're right. The equation really does begin with the expectations. And usually when I'm, coaching managers around this topic, I'm challenging them to think about, what are the expectations you have of your employees? And then what if I pause you there and I went and talked to your employees? Would they have the same answer?
That's exactly right. Yep.
And so I think to your point, and we think we're clear. We had that one meeting and we said this one thing and we expect everything to be, up to standard. When in fact, that isn't the way it works. So how do you navigate through that, Toni?
Well, I think a piece of it is, so you just said that, right? So I said that one time. Well, our responsibility as a leader is to flex with the communication style and the leadership style and the needs of our people on our team. And we invest in that. In our organization, we do a lot of that, right? We have DISC profiles on everybody. Some of us have even gone deeper than that. Well, what are you doing with that information? My responsibility, we talk about self-awareness as a leadership competency. Well, being self-aware, I know my leadership style, I know my communication style, but it's my responsibility to know that for the people on my team. And if I know that that individual receives information in a particular way, it's my job to adapt to make that occur. Because why? Well, is that me being rigid and saying, well, I shouldn't have to do that? Well, I want the best out of that person, and it benefits me none if they don't meet the expectation, right? We want them to succeed. We want them to flourish, not just succeed in completing the responsibility, whatever it is. So I think the first thing is we have to be flexible, one, to know what those needs are for our team members, and be flexible enough to communicate in a way that's going to reach them and they understand then those expectations you've communicated. But the same thing with accountability and feedback, right? So just because I would receive feedback in a particular way doesn't mean the people on my team would. So that's my responsibility to know that and to flex. And I talk to rising leaders that way too, that, wait a minute, now that's your responsibility. So that's probably a hard part of adjusting as we grow in an organization, is I'm very comfortable in self-awareness. I know what those things are about me. Well, now your job is to flex. So yeah, that's a big piece of it for me.
So when you're going into these feedback sessions, what are the most effective ways to hold someone accountable that you found? And do you have any stories about times this either went spectacularly well or spectacularly poorly?
Oh, we all have those, right? Whether it was, me as the person being held accountable, or it's the, team member that I'm meeting with. So going into those sessions, I think you have to do your part first. You have to gut check. Like, you were saying earlier, Matthew, like, how did I communicate these expectations? Was I clear about that? What did I communicate? Because that should be what we're measuring against, right? We're not measuring against the things that I didn't say or the things that I'd really like to have happened, but I didn't tell you. So that's, I think, one thing that's very important. And the other is always go into it with positive intent. Right? Don't think that the individual, especially if you did your work in the beginning, right? And we collectively, we shared, I shared my expectations, you shared yours. We walked out knowing very clearly what we were doing. Go into it with an expectation of positive intent. It's not likely that they're intentionally choosing to fail or intentionally choosing not to meet your expectations. If they are, then that's a different thing altogether. But the large majority of the time, they're not. So it goes back to, let's restate, what we've communicated before. Let's talk about what this is, whether it's specific responsibility or it's a value that you've talked through, like a communication timeline, or participation, responsiveness, what have you. Go back to that as the fundamental, because that's where you agreed, right? And so much of this is starting from a common place. And so there was a common agreement on those values and those expectations. So you start there. And then you say, well, from my perspective, I don't see this is not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing this. And then they can tell you if they agree or not, because they may maybe have a different perspective of that is meeting the expectation. So you start from that place of clarity of expectation that was previously communicated and you agreed to, and to ensuring you believe positive intent for the individual. And I think when you do that, you're in a stronger footing with this piece. The other that I usually bring into this, and so that I think a lot of times it can easily be, it's hard not to take feedback personally. It just is, right? So, but it's not, the intention, it shouldn't be. And so my intention is not that this is personal. I reinforce that, my responsibility to the organization is to ensure that we are meeting our collective responsibilities as a team. And I'm going to be held accountable for that. So my job is to make sure that you, as a member of this team, understands those expectations, has the resources to complete those expectations. And so my job is also the feedback when we're not doing that. So I put it back then to that this is my responsibility. I'm not doing my job. And somebody's going to have this conversation with me if I don't do these things, right? So that it's not about personal. It's about the organizational responsibilities and expectations. So it's bringing it to a bigger space than just this one position or one task.
I am just dying to hear a story though. I know you've got a wealth of stories, so I'm longing to hear some experience that you've had that I know we could all learn from.
So yeah, I have a number of these. There are some that I think of, some of those where it's the ones that didn't go well that come to mind first, because we learned from those, right? And I will say, as much as I have always thought I could inspire the best in people and draw out the absolute best, there are times where it's a mismatch. And it's a mismatch in the position and the person in it. How many times have you walked into an organization that you're the new person in town? Everybody else has been there. You didn't hire everybody on the team. You weren't the first one to articulate their responsibilities and onboard them. So you walk into an existing team. Now, the best thing to do is to be able to communicate your expectations up front and then talk through where those may have been different. But even when you do that, there may be people who look, oh, this isn't my thing, right? I hear what you're saying, Now, I appreciate what you're saying as expectations, but yeah, I'm not doing it. And that one, I think for me, floored me because, like I said, I'm so used to coming in, we can do this together, inspired to the bigger vision, the impact that we're going to make, and why your position is so critical, because every person on the team is critical. There is not one that is more so than another. All of them bring value, and that's my job to communicate that. So even when I've communicated value, even when I've reinforced expectation, even when I've made sure they've got the resources to meet all of that and to thrive, and they're still like, yeah, no, that's hard. That's really hard, because then you're like, now what do I do? I've put everything, like the kitchen sink has been thrown out at this, right? So that one for me stood out, but it showed me that again, that organizational responsibility to make sure everybody is in the right space and the right role to thrive and to grow. And so we had to have the conversation, okay, well, let's talk about what's next for you. So we need to have somebody in this position that's doing this, right? And is excited to be here, that they want to be a part and contribute and grow in this role. What are the things that you want to do? And let's talk about how to get you there. And it may mean that you're exiting the organization, or it may mean that you're moving into a different role if we have capacity to do that. We don't always have the capacity to do that. But it goes back again, our responsibility to the organization is that that team is functioning. So that means every member of that team needs to be functioning. So that's one that I'm like, oh, that always reminds me. But then I've seen the same where somebody was not thriving, and it could have been just as much as somebody telling them you believe in them and that they are valued as a member of the team, and understanding and taking the time to understand what's going on here. How can I help you? And that I'm genuinely interested in making sure that they're successful and that we need them to be. Because it's a lot of work to recruit and fill a position. You want the people on the team to be successful, and sometimes they just need to hear that. So those are the ones, and then seeing those people go out and just kill it because they're energized about their role and about the value they're contributing to the team.
Toni, you're hitting on so many elements of success factors and performance management and accountability. And I love the fact you're talking about relationships. In our last session, you're talking about clear expectations and owning, your responsibility in that, the dialogue, the fit with the organization, and having those hard conversations with people. So I'm guessing a lot of our listeners have varying levels of experience having these types of conversations, right? So you alluded to the fact that you kind of open up that dialogue almost from like your vantage point. You're seeing this, you're observing this, like an I message, if you will. Give our listeners some advice about the actual conversation, like the nitty gritty of that.
I think one, it's being prepared. I don't think you go into that not having practiced it. And I don't care how many times that you've had that conversation, I still take the time to prepare for that. But I do approach it with sincerity. So nitty gritty, what's the nuts and bolts of that? So I know with specificity, what are the things that I didn't see? So it's not these broad generalizations of, it didn't feel like that you've been blah, blah, blah. No, well, give me an example, because I would ask that question. Well, give me an example. What is it that you didn't see that you thought you should see? So know with specificity, what are those times where those expectations were not met? And the other piece with that, when I think about the times, don't go back and say, well, 3 months ago, when you should have had that conversation 3 months ago. So you need to have these conversations in a timely manner because it's fresh. They will remember that. If it didn't stand out to them as a misstep or something to be concerned about 3 months ago, it's not likely they're going to remember it. You do, because you saw it that way. So you need to have those in a timely manner from the issue that occurred. So that's one piece. But I do think the specificity is important. But always give them opportunity to speak, really, because this is one perspective. They may have a very different perspective. And we're people, so there are things that contribute to that occurrence. And we don't know those without asking and having that conversation. So again, if you're going into with positive intent, you lay out the specific issue. How is it different than the expectations you previously communicated, which you've got in front of you, and said, okay, these are the expectations we talked about before. And then give them opportunity to speak to that. You always want to come out of there, okay, what are we going to do next? So is this a one-off that we've brought it into attention, we're okay, we'll move on? Is it something that we need to continue to monitor? So you walk out with an action and a communication back to the individual. Sometimes these move into performance improvement plans. And when I've done performance improvement plans with an individual, it starts with these conversations. What was not met? What should it have looked like? Why is that important to the organization and to the role for those to occur? And then I ask them typically to prepare the first draft of the performance improvement plan, because I want to see them take ownership. I think that is so critical. If I'm taking ownership of their performance improvement, then that's not ever going to truly sink in and change how they participate in the organization. So I asked them to take ownership of that first draft. What are those things that you would do, for example, to improve your communication with your colleagues? If that's, for example, one of the challenges that we encountered. And see, how would they choose to address that? And what should that look like? And there are times where they've come up with way more than I would have come up with. And what I can tell from that is they took it seriously. They do want to improve. And they go off and they complete that performance improvement plan, and they come back and wow, they are meeting those expectations, and they took ownership in order to do that. And so I think that that's an important element, is you're always doing this together. I mentioned this several times, right? I reflect on how I've been a part of those conversations with, my boss, my leader, and how would I have wanted to be treated? When has that gone really well for me? And when have I really felt like it wasn't good? And anytime that I've been as equally engaged in the process is when I've felt, again, valued and able to contribute, and I'm growing in a way that is really a place where I do want to develop. So I think you have to come into this with mutual participation, mutual respect, and it really aligned to that common value of the team that you've invested in building. So sorry, I'm talking a lot about that.
This is fantastic. And I'm interested, so you do have, there's obviously a formal reporting relationship that helps with accountability if you have direct reports. What about situations where you need to influence someone, but they don't have any formal reporting relationship, and yet it's important for you to be holding each other accountable? How does it differ for peers rather than direct reports?
Fundamentally, it really shouldn't. Fundamentally, all those things that we talked about, right? Setting clear expectations, investing in relationship with each other, providing feedback, that shouldn't matter if they're reporting to you or not, right? Because you're all working from a common core of, the value to the organization, mutual respect. The reporting relationship and the supervision responsibility is that to the organization, I'm responsible to make sure that that person is thriving and that they are contributing in the way that they should. But the fundamental things that you bring into that interaction and that relationship is no different than if they report to you or if you're doing so through influence, really. Because I think for a long time, in the beginning of my career, it was all influence. You don't start out with people reporting to you. You're, as an individual contributor, a lot of what I did was through influence. And that was with senior leadership, that was with colleagues, and it was the things that we talked about. And as a member of the team, if I'm the team leader, and these are individuals who are working together as a cross-functional team, I still have to communicate expectations of the team. I still have to value what each member of the team is bringing to the table and have spoken to what that is. I still have to give feedback. I still have to have that conversation if we start to run off. And I'm doing so from a place of positive intent. So all of that is still the same. So yeah, fundamentally, I don't see a lot of difference in how you should approach it.
I think in the work that Laura and I do, we spend a lot of time talking about social capital, trust, influence, and, again, building relationships, all those things that you're talking about. So it sounds like that is a critical element in your peer-to-peer accountability approach as well, which I love. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. And I think of times when a colleague, a peer, and I have maybe experienced some conflict. And I think one is to be conscious of that. Two, that the relationship, the work relationship is so important. You want to address it. You don't want to leave that out there. Even if it, from a day-to-day responsibilities, you're running in parallel, you may say, well, it doesn't really matter. It matters. It matters a lot. So to take the time to address it and want to invest in that relationship with that person and make sure it's strong, it allows both of you to thrive and do well on behalf of the organization, even if what you do together is limited. And so, yeah, I've seen where that has paid off in dividends, that social capital and the relationship that's developed. It changes the landscape of how you work with one another on a team. You are invested in each other, and you are going to do so much more as a group because of that.
So you've given us so much to think about and so much great practical insight. Before we let you go, though, we'd really like to hear about how you approach one-on-one meetings. Do you have a predetermined list of items that you tend to go through? How do you tend to go about this with the people that you're meeting with one-on-one?
So I think that a little bit there's a structure for all of them that's the same, and then I do go back to each person is different. So I do try to adapt a bit to that individual. So there's also some flex around that. The way that I like to approach one-on-one with people on my team is I come in with a list of things and they come in with a list of things. And one, I want them to take shared ownership of that meeting, right? But two, it's also important for me to make sure that I've prepared for and been intentional about that interaction. And so shared responsibility with that meeting, and also have follow-up after. So I usually also include time asking about them. Again, it goes back to reinforcing the importance of developing relationship. I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to know everybody's kids' names and all that other stuff, but it's saying that you're an important part of my team. And in this time right now where we're all physically separated from one another, it's a lot harder to know that and do that. You have to be really intentional to do that. Because it can be easy, you're so used to, when you go into a meeting, you've got that couple of minutes, you got there early, you're checking in, hey, how you doing? How's everything going? And as you're walking out, maybe you're walking in the same direction and you do the same. When we're like this, you don't. You pop in, right? You're going from one to the one, and you come in, you have a meeting, bye, and you exit. So you're not developing social capital in the same way that we used to. So if you're not intentional about that, so you have to use those one-on-one meeting times to build that in the same way, especially because we're in this format. So I wish I could say that there was like a true art form for me for one-on-one meetings, but it goes back to being prepared, leading with intention, being intentional, that make the most out of that interaction with that person. It's fundamental. Don't be lazy about it.
Thank you so much. This has just been such tremendous information, and I know our listeners are going to gain a lot from this. And thank you for letting us leverage your expertise.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys. And I am so grateful for all the work that y'all do here at UAB Medicine. Developing our leaders, developing all of our team members is a critical aspect of any group's success. So thank you all for pouring into us, ensuring we have those resources.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Leadership in Practice radio show.